Doctor examines baby rushed to hospital and notices something strange. When the boy who brought her reveals the truth, she can't hold back her tears. The emergency room at Boston General breathed with its usual Thursday evening rhythm, but there was nothing usual about the weight pressing down on Dr. Sarah Mitchell's shoulders. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the institutional green walls, where faded photographs of past department heads seemed to watch over the controlled chaos below. The familiar symphony of medical equipment, the staccato beep of cardiac monitors, the soft whir of 4 pumps, the distant wail of an ambulance, normally faded into background noise after 12 hours on shift, but tonight each sound seemed to pierce through her growing fatigue. Sarah rolled her shoulders, trying to ease the knot of tension between her shoulder blades. Her dark hair was escaping from its neat bun, and her hands trembled slightly as she updated patient charts on her tablet. The tremors weren't just from exhaustion. She'd skipped lunch again. A bad habit that Nancy, her head nurse, constantly scolded her about. But after losing a teenage trauma patient that morning, food had been the last thing on her mind. "You should go home soon, Dr. Mitchell," Nancy said, appearing at her side with a knowing look. The older nurse had been here longer than most of the equipment, and she had an uncanny ability to read her staff. "You've been here since dawn." Sarah managed a weak smile. Just a few more charts to finish. She didn't add that going home to her empty apartment held little appeal. At least here, in this sterile maze of corridors and rooms, she had purpose. Here, she could make a difference the way someone had once made a difference for her. As if summoned by that thought, the automatic doors hissed open, letting in a blast of February air that carried with it a sound that made every head turn, the desperate cry of a child. "Please, somebody help." Sarah looked up to see a boy, no more than 12, stumbling through the entrance. His oversized gray hoodie was dark with sweat despite the winter chill, and in his arms, Sarah's heart jumped. He carried a bundle wrapped in what looked like a baby blanket. Steam rose from his clothing in the temperature difference, and his breath came in visible pants in the cold fluorescent light. "Sir, you need to stop right there," called Marcus, the security guard, moving to intercept him. "You need to check in at—" "No." The boy's voice cracked with raw desperation. "The baby, she's not moving right. Please." His eyes darted wildly around the room, and Sarah recognized the look of someone who had reached their absolute limit. Sarah was already moving, her tablet forgotten on the counter. "Let him through, Marcus." The authority in her voice made the security guard step aside, though he hovered nearby, uncertain. The sound of the boy's worn sneakers squeaking against the freshly waxed floor echoed off the walls, creating a frantic percussion to match his ragged breathing. As he rushed toward her, Sarah caught the scent of winter air clinging to his clothes, mixed with something else, baby powder and fear. Up close, she could see the terror in his eyes. They were an unusual amber color, red-rimmed and wild with fear. His dark skin had an ashen undertone that spoke of exhaustion, and there were dried tears tracking down his cheeks. "I've got you," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm and steady, though her own heart was racing. Something about his desperation triggered memories she usually kept carefully buried of another emergency room, another child trying to save someone they loved. "Come with me." She guided him to Trauma Room 3, calling over her shoulder, "Nancy, I need you." The harsh lighting in the trauma room seemed to intensify everything the boy's fear. The stillness of the bundle in his arms, the urgency thrumming through Sarah's veins. As the boy reluctantly laid the bundle on the examination table, Sarah caught a glimpse of his hands. They were shaking so badly he could barely let go of his precious cargo. The baby was tiny, probably no more than 3 months old, with caramel-colored skin a few shades lighter than the boy's. Most worrying was the stillness, not the peaceful stillness of sleep, but a limpness that sent ice through Sarah's veins. Her medical training kicked in automatically, but underneath it, a voice that sounded much younger whispered, "Not this time. I won't lose this one." Nancy appeared silently at her side as Sarah unwrapped the blanket. The baby wore only a diaper and a thin onesie, definitely not enough for the brutal Boston winter. The fabric was damp with sweat and something else, melted snow, Sarah realized. How far had this boy carried this child through the February night? "What's your name?" Sarah asked, her fingers gentle but swift as they began the examination. Each touch was a question, too cold. "Why so cold? What happened to you, little one?" "Marcus," he answered, hovering so close she could feel him trembling. "Marcus Thompson. Please, is she going to be okay?" His voice caught on the last word, and Sarah noticed his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. Sarah noted it was the second time he'd used it. The baby's skin was cool to the touch, and when she pressed her stethoscope to the tiny chest, the heartbeat was slower than she'd like. Each weak thump seemed to echo in Sarah's ears, a countdown she refused to acknowledge. "Nancy, get me a temperature," she ordered, then turned to Marcus. "How long has she been like this?" She kept her voice professional, but gentle. In her peripheral vision, she could see Nancy efficiently preparing equipment, anticipating needs before they were voiced. I don't." He swallowed hard, and fresh tears spilled over. "She was crying earlier, but then she got really quiet. Maybe an hour ago? I tried giving her milk, but she wouldn't take it, and then she stopped moving as much and I just—" His words tumbled out faster and faster until they seemed to choke him. He pressed his fist to his mouth, biting down on his knuckles. "Temperature's 95.1, Nancy reported, her experienced face tight with concern. The numbers hung in the air like a verdict. "Start warming measures," Sarah commanded, her mind already racing through protocols and possibilities. "And get me a pediatric 4 kit." She turned back to Marcus, who looked ready to collapse. His knees were actually shaking, and Sarah pulled over a stool with her foot. "Sit before you fall, Marcus." When was the last time she had a full feeding? The boy sank onto the stool, but his body remained tense, ready to spring up at any moment. His hands twisted in the front of his hoodie, and Sarah noticed they were chapped and red, as if he'd been washing them repeatedly. "Last night, I think? She only took a little this morning, and then—" He broke off, staring at the baby with such intensity that Sarah could almost feel the weight of his guilt. Sarah's mind was already cataloging possibilities. Hypothermia, definitely. Dehydration, probable, possible infection. But something wasn't adding up. The baby's clothes were clean, the diaper recently changed. There were no obvious signs of trauma, but there were some unusual marks on the skin that she couldn't immediately identify. Someone had been trying to care for this child, trying hard, but without the knowledge or resources to do it properly. "Marcus, I need you to tell me, are you this baby's brother? Where are your parents?" The question seemed to drain what little color remained in his face. His eyes darted to the door, and Sarah recognized the look of someone about to bolt. She'd worn that same expression enough times in her own youth, standing in front of social workers and teachers who asked too many questions. "Hey," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. His hoodie was still damp with melted snow, and she could feel him trembling beneath the fabric. "I'm not here to judge. I'm here to help. But I need to know what's going on so I can give her the best care possible. Do you understand?" For a moment, Sarah was transported back 25 years, to a night when she'd stood in a different emergency room, trying to explain to a doctor why she'd been hiding her little foster brother's fever. The same fear that had choked her then was visible now in Marcus's eyes. The terror of having a system sweep in and tear apart what little family you had managed to piece together. Marcus's lower lip trembled. He looked from Sarah to the baby and back again, torn between trust and terror. The monitors beeped steadily in the background, marking each precious second. Before he could answer, Nancy returned with the 4 kit and another nurse in tow. "Dr. Mitchell," Nancy said in a low voice that nevertheless carried in the tense silence, "I've called up to PICU. They're ready for us when you give the word. Should I contact social services?" Marcus made a small, wounded sound, like something breaking inside him, and Sarah saw tears spill over onto his cheeks. "Please," he whispered, "please don't take her away. I was trying to help her. I was trying so hard." His voice cracked on the last word, and he pressed his fist against his mouth again, trying to hold back sobs. Sarah's hands moved automatically, preparing the 4 while her mind raced. The baby's arm was so tiny that finding a vein would be challenging even if she weren't slightly dehydrated. As Sarah worked, she found herself humming softly, the same lullaby she'd sung to her foster brother all those years ago. She noticed Marcus lean forward slightly, drawn by the gentle sound. "Nancy," Sarah said, making a decision that came from somewhere deeper than medical training, "hold off on that call for now. Let's stabilize our patient first." She turned back to Marcus, keeping her voice soft but firm. "I need you to be brave for a few more minutes. Can you do that? Can you help me help her?" He nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. In the harsh lighting, Sarah could see dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. How long had he been carrying this burden alone? "Good. Now, why don't you tell me how you found her?" As Sarah worked to raise the baby's temperature and start the four, her hands steady now, drawing strength from years of practice and the urgency of the moment, Marcus's story began to spill out, piece by broken piece. His words came in rushes and halts, like a stream finding its way around obstacles. The baby stirred slightly as warm saline flowed into her tiny veins, and Sarah saw Marcus's whole body sag with relief. His hand reached out instinctively toward the infant, then pulled back, uncertain. Sarah noticed calluses on his palms that seemed out of place on a 12-year-old. What had this child been through? Outside the trauma room, Boston General continued its endless rhythm of life and death. Through the glass walls, Sarah could see other dramas unfolding, nurses rushing past with supplies, doctors conferring over charts, families waiting anxiously for news. But in here, time seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would bloom from this moment of intersection between a desperate boy, an abandoned baby, and a doctor who recognized in them both a reflection of her own past. The monitors showed the baby's heart rate beginning to stabilize, each steady beep a small victory. Sarah caught Nancy's eye and saw understanding there. Her experienced nurse had already guessed that this case would be different, that sometimes protocol had to bend a little to let hope find its way through. As she worked, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just another case. This was a turning point. She could feel it in her bones, the way she sometimes could with patients who would change her life forever. Her hands might be steady now, but her heart was racing with possibilities and fears she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everyone in their harsh, unforgiving glare. But as Sarah watched Marcus finally give in to exhaustion, slumping forward in his chair while still keeping one hand near the baby's blanket, she saw something else in that sterile light, the first glimmer of a new beginning, as fragile and precious as the tiny life she was fighting to save. Sarah didn't know it yet, but this night would change everything for all of them. And somewhere in the vast, cold city outside, dawn was approaching, bringing with it the promise of warmth, of hope, of second chances. This time, she silently promised both her patients things would be different. This time, family would win. The harsh fluorescent lights of the PICU buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in that peculiar hospital pallor that made even the healthy look ill. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she filled out the preliminary admission forms for the baby, now temporarily designated as Baby Doe in the hospital system. The tremors weren't from exhaustion anymore. They came from the effort of restraining herself from checking on her tiny patient every 2 minutes. The antiseptic smell that permeated everything in the hospital seemed particularly strong tonight, mixing with the lingering scent of coffee and fear. Up in the pediatric intensive care unit, the infant was finally stabilizing under warming blankets and 4 fluids, her color improving with each passing hour. The steady beep of monitors created a reassuring rhythm, though Sarah knew better than most how quickly that rhythm could change. Through the glass partition, she could see Marcus slumped in a waiting room chair, his body curled into itself like a wounded animal. Even in sleep, his face held a tension that no 12-year-old should carry. The institutional lighting cast shadows under his eyes that made him look older, more worn. His worn hoodie still bore damp patches from his desperate journey through the winter night. Protocol demanded she call Child Protective Services immediately. The story he'd finally shared, finding the baby behind Wilson's Market 2 days ago, keeping her secret in his bedroom while his grandmother lay ill in the next room, raised more red flags than a Soviet parade. But something in his desperate care for the infant struck a chord deep within Sarah's memories. "You're thinking too hard," Nancy said, appearing at her shoulder with 2 cups of coffee from the decent machine in the staff room, not the sludge they served visitors. "I can hear the gears grinding from down the hall, the rich aroma of real coffee cut through the medical sterility, a small comfort in the pre-dawn hours." Sarah accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. "Did you know," she said, keeping her voice low, "that he's been heating formula in a bowl of hot tap water because he read online that microwaves can create hot spots dangerous for babies? He's been studying baby care websites on his phone between classes." Nancy, taking notes in a little notebook I found in his backpack. She pulled out the notebook, a cheap spiral-bound thing with a bent cover. Inside, in careful adolescent handwriting, were lists, formula temperatures, diaper changing steps, warning signs for fever. Some entries were marked with stars, others with urgent underlines. One page simply read "Don't fail her" in letters pressed so hard into the paper they'd left impressions on the next 3 pages. Nancy's expression softened as she glanced at the notebook. In her 30 years of nursing, she'd seen everything, but sometimes a case still managed to pierce the professional armor. "Smart kid. Too smart." Sarah pushed back from the desk, rolling her neck to ease the tension. In the fluorescent lights, her reflection in the window looked ghostly, superimposed over the sleeping form of Marcus beyond the glass. He knew enough to be terrified when her temperature dropped, but not enough to understand the danger before that. He's been keeping her alive through sheer force of will for 2 days. Nancy. 2 days. She thought about what they'd found in his backpack along with the notebook, 3 different types of formula because he wasn't sure which was best, receiving blankets he'd apparently purchased from a thrift store, even a small hot water bottle he'd been using to keep the baby warm. Each item told a story of desperate, determined love. The older nurse settled into the chair next to her, close enough that their conversation wouldn't carry to curious ears. "Tell me what you're really thinking, Sarah. I know that look." Sarah stared into her coffee cup as if it might hold answers. The truth was, she'd been thinking about her own past more in the last few hours than she had in years. The memories rose unbidden, nights spent checking her foster brother's temperature by flashlight, hiding medicine and cool compresses under her mattress. The terror of discovery warring with the need to protect. "When I was 13, she said finally, "I hid my foster brother's fever for almost 3 days because I was afraid they'd send him away if he was too much trouble. By the time he had a seizure and I couldn't hide it anymore." She shook her head, but the memory played anyway. The cruel fluorescent lights of another emergency room, the accusatory stares, the crushing weight of failure. "That's why you became a doctor?" "That's why I became an emergency pediatric specialist." Sarah managed a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I thought if I could just save enough children, maybe it would balance out my stupid, selfish mistake. Maybe I could sleep without seeing his face during that seizure." She looked down the hall toward the waiting room where Marcus slept, his body twitching occasionally as if even in sleep he was trying to solve problems. But this kid, he did everything wrong in exactly the right way, if that makes sense. Every mistake he made came from love. Nancy followed her gaze. "The grandmother's story checks out, by the way. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Her oncologist is actually here at Boston General. Dr. Ramirez says she's been missing appointments. Now we know why. She has maybe 2 months left, 3 if she's lucky." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "And Marcus? No other family that we can find so far. Father's never been in the picture, not even listed on the birth certificate. Mother died of an overdose 4 years ago in a halfway house in Dorchester." Nancy paused, her voice softening. "The brother he mentioned, Tommy, died last year from an undiagnosed congenital heart condition. Collapsed during recess. Marcus was there when it happened." "Jesus." Sarah ran a hand through her hair, completely destroying what was left of her professional bun. "No wonder he couldn't bear to let go of another baby. He's been watching everyone he loves slip away, one by one." She remembered Marcus's earlier fragments of explanation, I heard crying behind the dumpster. She was so cold. I couldn't just leave her there like garbage. Not like Mom left us. Each word had carried years of accumulated pain. The soft ping of the elevator at the end of the hall made them both look up. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the purposeful stride of Patricia Chun from Child Protective Services. She'd worked with Patricia before. She was good at her job, caring but efficiently professional. Tonight, though, Sarah wished she'd taken longer to arrive. Dr. Mitchell. Patricia nodded as she approached, her practical boots squeaking slightly on the freshly waxed floor. Nancy, I understand we have a complicated situation. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion from the waiting room made all three women turn. Marcus was awake, and from his wide-eyed expression, he'd seen Patricia's arrival too. Sarah was moving before she consciously decided to, but she wasn't fast enough to prevent him from bolting. Marcus, wait! But the boy was already running, his worn sneakers surprisingly quiet on the hospital floors. He moved like someone who knew how to avoid attention, hugging the walls, ducking around corners, the practiced invisibility of a child who'd learned early that being noticed usually meant being hurt. Sarah followed, her own shoes far less stealthy on the polished tiles. She caught up with him in the small courtyard between the main hospital and the parking structure, a sad little attempt at a healing garden that mostly served as a smoking area for staff, though it was empty now in the pre-dawn chill. Dead leaves skittered across the cracked concrete, and a few stubborn plants struggled in their neglected containers. A plastic bench sat empty beneath a leafless tree, its slats covered in a thin layer of frost. Marcus stood with his back against the brick wall, chest heaving, tears streaming down his face. In the weak security lighting, she could see his breath coming in desperate clouds. You promised, he gasped between sobs. You promised you wouldn't call them. Everyone always promises and then they... He choked on the words. I promised to help you, Sarah corrected gently, keeping her distance. And I'm trying to, Marcus. But I need you to trust me. They'll take her away. His voice cracked like thin ice. They'll put her in the system and I'll never see her again and she'll think nobody wanted her. Just like... He cut himself off, but Sarah heard the unspoken words. Just like me. Like you did, she asked softly. Marcus slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold ground, his knees pulled up to his chest. A withered flower lay next to him, knocked loose from one of the planters. Another discarded life in this place of loss and healing. How did you know? The way you look at doorways, Sarah said quietly, moving closer. Always knowing where the exits are. The way you flinch when adults move too fast. But mostly, she sat down next to him, not touching, just sharing the space. Mostly it's the way you're trying so hard to be the person you needed when you were younger. Her words seemed to crack something open in him. After Mom died, he whispered, they put us in different homes at first. Me and Tommy. He was only 4. He'd cry all night for me. Marcus wiped his eyes roughly with his sleeve. When Grandma finally found us and got custody, she promised we'd never be separated again. But then Tommy's heart. And now she's... His voice broke completely. Tell me about the baby, Sarah prompted gently. Tell me everything, from the beginning. Marcus took a shuddering breath. I take the shortcut behind Wilson's Market to get Grandma's prescriptions. It's faster, and sometimes Mr. Wilson gives me the day-old bread for free if I help him break down boxes. He picked at a loose thread on his hoodie. 2 days ago I heard crying. Really weak crying. Behind the dumpster, there was this box. He described finding the infant, barely moving, wrapped in a thin blanket. How he'd run home with her, terrified but determined. How he'd spent his saved-up birthday money on formula and supplies, studying baby care websites late into the night. How he'd pretend to go to school but double back home to check on her, keeping her warm with hot water bottles and his own body heat when she seemed cold. I made a little nest for her in my closet, he said, his voice small. Used my old science fair display board as a wall so Grandma wouldn't see if she came in. His hands twisted together. I told her stories about Tommy, about how he would have loved being a big brother to her. I promised her she'd never be alone like we were, Sarah felt tears pricking at her own eyes. "You did everything you could, but it wasn't enough." The words burst out of him. "She got so quiet, and I couldn't warm her up, and I was so scared." He turned to Sarah, his eyes desperate. "I can't lose anyone else. Please, she's all I have left." Without thinking, Sarah reached over and pulled him into her arms. He stiffened for a moment, then collapsed against her, sobs shaking his thin frame. She held him as the sky began to lighten, thinking of all the children like them. The ones who had to grow up too fast, who carried burdens too heavy for their young shoulders. "I have an idea," she said finally, when his tears had quieted. "But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" He pulled back slightly, searching her face. "Why should I?" "Because I've been where you are. Because I understand what it's like to love someone so much you'd break rules to protect them." She smiled slightly. "And because I think I might know a way to keep your family together. All of it. Even the newest member." Above them, the first real light of morning painted the clouds in shades of hope. And somewhere in the hospital, a baby girl was growing stronger with each passing minute, waiting for her family to be made whole. The transition from night to morning at Boston General always reminded Sarah of a slow-motion title change. The hushed efficiency of night gradually gave way to the awakening hospital, crash carts being restocked with metallic clinks, the first coffee cart's wheels squeaking past, the gradual increase in voices and footsteps echoing through corridors. Through the windows, the pale February sunrise painted weak rectangles on the institutional floors, competing with the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. The familiar morning scents wafted through the air, fresh coffee from the nurse's station mingling with the ever-present hospital antiseptic, accompanied by the faint aroma of toast from the cafeteria 4 floors below. Sarah led Marcus through this awakening world, acutely aware of how small he seemed in the morning rush, how his shoulders hunched slightly against the noise and movement. Patricia Chun was waiting for them by the PICU entrance, her practical boots planted firmly on the freshly waxed floor, her expression carefully neutral. Sarah felt Marcus's hand clutch the edge of her scrubs, his fingers trembling slightly. But there was something else in his grip too, a determination that hadn't been there before their talk in the garden. "Marcus," Patricia said, her voice gentle but professional, "I'm Ms. Chun from Child Protective Services. I'd like to talk with you about—" "I want to see her first," Marcus interrupted. His voice carried the same mix of fear and determination Sarah had felt in his grip. He looked up at her, amber eyes pleading. "Please? Just to make sure she's okay." Sarah met Patricia's gaze over Marcus's head. In her years of emergency medicine, she'd learned to read the subtle languages of bureaucracy and compassion. Patricia's slight softening around the eyes, the way she shifted her weight, small tells that suggested an understanding heart behind the professional facade. After a moment, Patricia nodded. 5 minutes, she said. "Dr. Mitchell can take you in while I speak with your grandmother's oncologist." "You called Grandma?" Marcus's voice cracked on the word. Sarah saw his free hand move to his pocket, where she knew he kept a small photo of his family. Taken before his mother's death, before Tommy's heart gave out, before his grandmother's diagnosis. Before life had taught him how quickly love could turn to loss. "She deserves to know where you are," Patricia replied. "She's been very worried." Sarah watched emotions war across Marcus's face, guilt at causing his grandmother more worry, fear of the consequences, and underneath it all, a fierce protectiveness that made him seem both older and younger than his 12 years. She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Come on, let's check on our patient." The PICU existed in its own pocket of space and time, separated from the general bustle by double doors and strict protocols. The sounds here were different, more mechanical, more measured. The soft whoosh of ventilators, the steady beeping of monitors, the hushed conversations of specialized nurses. Their footsteps were muffled by the special flooring as Sarah led Marcus to Hope's isolation room. Through the glass, the baby looked impossibly small in her warming bed, surrounded by equipment that seemed oversized in comparison. The morning light caught the plastic of her isolette, creating small rainbows that danced across her peaceful face. Marcus pressed his hand against the glass, leaving a small imprint that quickly faded. Her temperature's up to 98.2, Sarah said, checking the chart and feeling a surge of relief at the improving numbers. Heart rate and oxygen levels are normal. She's responding well to the antibiotics we started for the mild infection. And she stopped, realizing Marcus wasn't listening. His entire focus was on Hope, his breath fogging the glass slightly as he leaned closer. She's got more color, he whispered, voice thick with emotion. And she's moving more. Indeed, the infant's tiny fists were making small, jerky movements in her sleep, as if reaching for something or someone. Can I touch her? Sarah helped him through the careful ritual of PICU entry, washing hands, donning a protective gown, applying sanitizer. She noticed how his hands shook slightly as he tied the gown, but his movements were deliberate, careful. This was a boy who understood the weight of responsibility, who had learned too young the cost of carelessness. The steady beep of the heart monitor created a gentle rhythm as they entered the room, like a tiny metronome keeping time in this suspended moment. The air was warmer here, carefully climate-controlled for the fragile life they protected. Morning light filtered through the blinds, creating soft stripes across the warming bed. "Hey, little one," Marcus said softly, reaching through the port in the warming bed. His voice carried a tenderness that made Sarah's heart ache. "I'm sorry I messed up, but Dr. Mitchell fixed it, just like I promised she would." As Sarah watched, Hope's tiny fingers curled reflexively around Marcus's larger one. The contact seemed to release something in him, tension flowing out of his shoulders, tears gathering in his eyes. The baby made a small sound, somewhere between a sigh and a coo, and her eyelids fluttered briefly before settling back into peaceful sleep. "Remember when Tommy was in the hospital?" Marcus whispered, so quietly Sarah almost missed it. He was always calmer when someone held his hand too. The nurses said even sleeping people know when someone loves them. He swallowed hard. "I couldn't save him, but I had to try to save her. I couldn't watch another baby slip away." Sarah felt her own eyes burning with tears. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest, not just the professional implications, but the personal ones. Was she really ready to open her life, her heart, to this responsibility? Her apartment was spare, clinical almost, arranged around her demanding schedule. She'd kept it that way deliberately, telling herself she was too busy for attachments, too focused on her career to consider fostering again. But watching Marcus with Hope, she remembered another hospital room, another child desperate to protect someone they loved. She remembered the doctor who had seen past her fear and defiance, who had offered not just medical care but a chance at family. "You didn't mess up," Sarah said firmly, pushing aside her own doubts. "You kept her alive. You got her help when she needed it. Those are the actions of someone who deserves to be in her life." Marcus looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the same fear she'd once carried, the terror of hoping too much, of letting yourself believe in something good only to have it snatched away. "But Ms. Chan is here to help make that happen safely and legally." Sarah pulled up a chair next to the warming bed, the vinyl squeaking slightly under her weight. The choice she was about to offer terrified her, but sometimes the scariest decisions were the most important ones. "Marcus, I need to tell you something about what I'm planning, but I need you to understand it might not work exactly the way we hope. Can you handle that?" He nodded, though his hand tightened slightly around Hope's fingers. A monitor beeped softly in response to the pressure, and he immediately gentled his grip, showing an instinctive care that made Sarah's decision feel more right with each passing moment. "I want to apply to be her foster parent," Sarah said quietly, "with the eventual goal of adoption." Marcus's face fell, the brief joy she'd seen earlier crumpling into resigned loss. It was an expression no child should wear with such familiarity. And she continued, holding up a hand, "I want to make sure you and your grandmother remain a part of her life, legally and permanently." The hope that flickered across his face was like watching a sunrise, gradual, tentative, but undeniably bright. "You can do that? It's called an open adoption." Sarah leaned forward, choosing her words carefully. She couldn't offer false promises, not when she knew how cruel the system could be. "But Marcus, there are a lot of steps between here and there. The police will need to try to find her birth parents. There will be investigations and paperwork and court dates. Could take months, maybe longer. What happens to her during all that? His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many temporary solutions become permanent separations. Well, that's where it gets interesting. Sarah managed a small smile, though her heart was racing with the enormity of what she was proposing. You see, I'm already certified as a foster parent. I've kept my certification active even though I haven't fostered in a while. And I happen to know that Patricia Chun has a history of supporting kinship-like placements when they're in the best interest of the child. Understanding dawned slowly in Marcus's eyes, like ice melting in spring. So she could stay with you, and we could visit. That's the idea. But Sarah held up a hand again as his excitement built. The next part was crucial. This only works if everyone is honest from here on out. The police, CPS, the courts, they all need to know exactly what happened. No more secrets. Fear flickered across his face. Will they arrest me? For saving an abandoned infant and then seeking medical help? No, they'll want to talk to you, and some of the questions might be hard. But you didn't commit a crime. Sarah touched his arm gently. You did something brave and kind, even if the way you went about it wasn't quite right. Marcus looked down at Hope, who was still holding his finger with surprising strength for someone so tiny. His other hand went to his pocket again, touching the photo she knew was there. My grandma. His voice broke. She's really sick. The doctors say maybe 2 months. I can't. The words seemed to stick in his throat, but Sarah heard them anyway. I can't lose everyone again. That's part of why this arrangement could work, Sarah said softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. Your grandmother would know you have a connection to a family that cares about you. And you would know that you always have a place with us. Even after. She let the sentence hang, the unspoken truth heavy in the air between them. Hope made a small sound in her sleep, drawing their attention. Her tiny face scrunched up briefly before relaxing again, and Marcus smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look, for just a moment, like the child he should have been allowed to remain. She needs a name, he said, still watching her face. We can't keep calling her Baby Doe. Do you have one in mind? Marcus was quiet for a moment, just watching Hope breathe. In the growing morning light, the medical equipment cast gentle shadows across her face, like guardian angels keeping watch. Hope, he said finally, because that's what she gave me, even when everything else was falling apart. Even when I was so scared I could barely think. She kept holding on, like she knew somebody would come. Sarah felt tears spill over onto her cheeks. Hope, she repeated softly. It's perfect. A soft knock at the door made them both turn. Patricia Chun stood there, and Sarah saw something in her expression she'd never seen before, a softness that suggested the professional facade had cracked just a little, letting the human being beneath shine through. It's time for our talk, she said gently. Marcus looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Remember, she said, no more secrets. Just tell the truth. Will you? He swallowed hard, looking back at Hope. Will you stay with her while I'm gone? Of course. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. She'll be right here when you're done. We both will. As she watched Marcus follow Patricia out of the room, Sarah sent up a silent prayer to whatever force watched over lost children and the adults trying to save them. Looking around her empty PICU room, she tried to imagine it transformed into a nursery, her quiet evenings filled with bottles and lullabies instead of medical journals. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The morning sun had finally broken through the winter clouds completely, sending streams of light through the PICU windows. They fell across Hope's warming bed like a benediction, turning the medical equipment into something almost magical. Sarah settled into the chair Marcus had vacated, taking her turn at keeping watch. Welcome to the family, Hope, she whispered, reaching through the port to stroke the baby's soft cheek. All of us, in the quiet of the PICU, with only the steady beep of monitors for company. Sarah began to plan how to turn her carefully ordered life upside down for the chance to build something beautiful from the broken pieces fate had handed them all. Detective Sandra Rivera had seen her share of abandoned baby cases in 15 years with Boston PD, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way Dr. Mitchell hovered protectively near the interview room door, or how the boy, Marcus Thompson, sat with his shoulders squared despite his obvious exhaustion, as if preparing for battle. "Let's start at the beginning," Sandra said gently, setting her recorder on the conference room table. They'd chosen this room in the hospital's administrative wing rather than taking Marcus to the station, a decision influenced heavily by Dr. Mitchell's insistence that her patient shouldn't be far from the PICU. Marcus glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "It was Tuesday afternoon," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "Around 4:30. I always cut through the alley behind Wilson's Market on my way back from the pharmacy. It's faster, and sometimes Mr. Wilson gives me day-old bread if I help him break down boxes." "You were picking up medication?" "For my grandmother. She has pancreatic cancer." His hands twisted together on the table. "Usually I go right after school, but I had to stay late for math tutoring. It was already getting dark and really cold. The kind of cold that hurts when you breathe." Sandra noticed Sarah shift slightly at this detail, no doubt thinking about the infant's hypothermia. "What happened next?" "I heard something, really faint, like a kitten crying. I almost didn't check. I was worried about getting Grandma's medicine home, but then I remembered how Tommy always used to rescue strays and—" "Tommy was your brother?" Sandra asked, though she'd already read the file. Marcus nodded, blinking hard. "He died last year. Heart problem nobody knew about. He was only 6, but he could never walk past an animal that needed help. So I thought I should check. For him." The detective watched as Sarah moved closer to Marcus, not touching him but offering silent support. The doctor's face held an expression Sandra had seen before, the look of someone who recognized themselves in another's pain. "The crying was coming from behind the big dumpster," Marcus continued. "There was this cardboard box. One of those ones fancy baby clothes come in with tissue paper and everything. But the tissue was wet from snow, and when I opened it—" His voice cracked. Sarah handed him a paper cup of water, and he took a careful sip before continuing. "She was so small and cold, really cold. There was a note, but it got wet and fell apart when I tried to read it. I could only make out something about sorry and better life. I kept the pieces, though." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a plastic sandwich bag containing fragments of wet paper. Sandra accepted the bag carefully. Even through the plastic, she could see the ink had run, making most of the text illegible. Another dead end, most likely, but forensics would try anyway. "What did you do then?" "I took off my hoodie and wrapped her in it. Ran home as fast as I could. I know I should have called 911, but—" He looked down at his hands. "The last time I called 911, it was for Tommy. They couldn't save him. And I thought maybe this time I could save someone myself." The raw honesty in his voice made Sandra's throat tight. She'd interviewed countless witnesses over the years, but there was something about this boy's combination of determination and vulnerability that cut through her professional distance. "Tell me about the next 2 days." What followed was a detailed account that impressed Sandra despite herself. Marcus described researching infant care online, spending his birthday money on formula and supplies, creating a makeshift nursery in his closet. He'd kept the baby warm with hot water bottles, learned to test formula temperature on his wrist, even figured out how to muffle her cries with his old white noise machine so his grandmother wouldn't hear. "I knew it wasn't right," he said finally, keeping her secret. "But I was afraid if I told anyone, they'd just take her away, put her in the system. And I know what that's like, how it feels when nobody wants you except as a temporary solution. Before Grandma found us." He trailed off, then squared his shoulders again. "But then she got so quiet, and her skin felt different, and I remembered how Tommy looked right before. I couldn't let that happen again. So I ran here." Sandra turned off her recorder. "You did the right thing, Marcus. Coming to the hospital when you did probably saved her life. What happens now?" His voice was small, but his gaze was steady. "Are you going to arrest me?" "No," Sandra said firmly. "You're not in trouble. In fact, I'd say you're a hero. Not many 12-year-olds would have gone to such lengths to save an abandoned infant. But you'll try to find her real parents? We'll try to find the person who abandoned her, yes. That's a crime, leaving a baby in those conditions. But from what you've described and the state of that note, I suspect we're dealing with someone who felt they had no other options. Sandra leaned forward slightly. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is make sure a child ends up with people who can give them the love and care they deserve. Which brings me to my next question. Dr. Mitchell has explained her proposal to you. Marcus nodded, a flicker of hope crossing his face. About fostering hope, the baby, and maybe adoption, and letting me and Grandma still be part of her life. It's an unusual situation, Sandra admitted, but I've worked with Dr. Mitchell before. She has an excellent reputation, and she's already certified as a foster parent. I'll be putting my support behind her application in my report. The boy's entire body seemed to relax, as if a great weight had lifted from his shoulders. Sarah stepped forward finally, resting a hand on his shoulder. Thank you for telling the truth, Marcus, the detective said softly. I know it wasn't easy, but it was the brave thing to do. Just like saving hope in the first place. Can I? Marcus swallowed hard. Can I go see her now? Sandra nodded, gathering her files. Of course. Dr. Mitchell can take you up. I'll need to talk to your grandmother later, but that can wait until she's feeling up to it. As she watched them leave, the boy walking tall despite his exhaustion, the doctor guiding him with gentle protectiveness. Sandra found herself hoping this case would be one of the rare ones where everything worked out as it should. In her line of work, happy endings were never guaranteed, but sometimes, just sometimes, broken pieces could fit together to make something whole and beautiful. She looked down at the bag containing the fragments of the note. Maybe forensics would find something useful, maybe not. But the real evidence of love and hope was currently sleeping in the PICU, surrounded by people determined to give her the future she deserved. Sarah's voice drifted back from the hallway. Come on, let's go see how Hope is doing. I think she's probably missing you by now. Sandra smiled slightly as she packed up her recorder. Some cases changed everyone they touched. This, she suspected, was one of them. 3 months after Hope was rushed into the emergency room on that cold February night, Sarah stood in what used to be her home office, now transformed into a nursery. The morning sun streamed through gauzy curtains, casting soft shadows on pale yellow walls. Where medical textbooks once lined shelves, now sat carefully curated children's books, many of them bearing bookplates that read from Marcus's library. Hope lay in her crib, babbling quietly to herself as she batted at the mobile hanging above, a handmade creation featuring tiny fabric hearts and stars that Marcus had worked on during his daily visits. At 5 months old, she was thriving, her dark eyes bright with curiosity and her infectious laugh becoming a regular soundtrack to Sarah's days. The sound of the doorbell pulled Sarah from her reverie. That'll be them, she murmured to Hope, lifting the baby into her arms. Ready to see your big brother? The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, home studies, and adjustments. The police had never located Hope's birth mother, though they'd found security camera footage of a young woman in a dark coat leaving the box behind Wilson's Market. Detective Rivera had eventually classified it as an unresolved abandonment case, while simultaneously fast-tracking Sarah's foster care placement. Sarah opened her front door to find Marcus standing there, one hand supporting his grandmother Eleanor's elbow as she navigated the 3 shallow steps with her walker. Despite the warm May morning, Eleanor wore a light sweater to ward off the perpetual chill that accompanied her illness. Her face was drawn with pain, but her eyes lit up at the sight of Hope. There's my sunshine girl, Eleanor said, her voice weak but warm. Marcus, help me to the sofa, dear. These old bones need a rest. Sarah watched as Marcus guided his grandmother with practiced care, noting how much older he seemed than the desperate boy who'd burst into her ER. There was still pain in his eyes. How could there not be, with Eleanor's condition steadily worsening? But there was peace there too, and purpose. Once Eleanor was settled, Marcus crossed back to Sarah and Hope, his movements eager but controlled. Hey, baby sister, he said softly, reaching for Hope's outstretched hands. "Look what I brought you." He pulled a small, worn teddy bear from his backpack. This was Tommy's, he explained, though Sarah had heard the story before. "Grandma found it when we were going through some boxes yesterday. I thought, maybe Hope should have it." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched Hope immediately grab for the teddy bear, stuffing one worn ear into her mouth. "It's perfect, Marcus." "Thank you, Sarah," Eleanor called from the sofa, her voice tired but determined. "Bring that beautiful girl over here where I can see her properly." As Sarah settled beside Eleanor with Hope in her lap, she caught sight of their reflection in the window, the elderly woman, the doctor, the boy, and the baby. An unlikely family, pieced together from loss and hope and second chances. The morning sun painted them in gentle light, turning the ordinary moment into something almost sacred. "I wanted to talk to you both about something," Eleanor said, reaching out to touch Hope's cheek with a trembling hand. "The doctors say I probably won't make it to her adoption hearing in July." "Grandma." "Don't," Marcus started, but Eleanor shook her head. "Hush now, love. We need to talk about this." She turned to Sarah. "I've asked my lawyer to draw up papers. I want to make sure that after I'm gone, Marcus has a legal connection to Hope and to you. If you're willing, joint guardianship," Sarah finished softly. They discussed this possibility with the social workers, an unusual arrangement where she would become Marcus's legal guardian alongside her adoption of Hope, creating a legally recognized family unit. "Eleanor, are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My grandson saved that child's life, and in doing so, he saved a piece of himself too. I've watched him these past months, seeing how he lights up when he's with her, how he's planning for a future again instead of just enduring the present." She reached for Marcus's hand. "You've given him something I couldn't, the chance to keep being a big brother." Marcus's other hand was still holding Hope's, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her tiny palm. The baby gurgled happily, reaching for her new teddy bear with her free hand. "But that's not all," Eleanor continued. "Sarah, you've given me peace, knowing that both my grandchildren, and yes, I consider Hope as much my grandchild as Marcus, will have a mother who understands what it means to fight for family. I can face what's coming with a lighter heart." Sarah couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she reached for Eleanor's free hand, completing the circle of touch that bound them all together. "Family isn't always what we expect it to be," Eleanor said softly. "Sometimes it's what we build from the broken pieces life hands us. Sometimes it's a boy brave enough to run through the night with a baby in his arms, or a doctor wise enough to see past rules to what really matters." Hope chose that moment to let out a peal of laughter, reaching up to pat Marcus's cheek with her tiny hand. The teddy bear tumbled from her grasp, and Marcus caught it with the practiced ease of a big brother, making her laugh again. "See?" Eleanor smiled, though tears were sliding down her cheeks. "She knows. She's always known who her family is." Sarah looked around at this unlikely gathering, the dying woman who had taught her grandson about unconditional love, the boy who had risked everything to save an abandoned baby, the infant who had somehow brought them all together. Through the window, she could see the spring sunshine painting her small garden in shades of new growth and possibility. "So," Eleanor said, her voice growing tired but her eyes still bright, "what do you say, Sarah? Ready to officially become a mother of two?" Sarah looked at Marcus, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and fear that reminded her so much of that first night. "What do you think, Marcus? Ready to be part of this slightly unconventional family?" His smile was answer enough, but he said it anyway. "We already are a family. This just makes it official." Hope babbled in apparent agreement, reaching for the teddy bear again. As Sarah watched Marcus return it to her with infinite gentleness, she thought about how life's greatest gifts often came disguised as its greatest challenges. 3 months ago, a desperate boy had carried a dying baby into her ER. Today, that same boy was helping to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. A family forged in crisis, strengthened by love, and sustained by the kind of hope that only comes when brave hearts refuse to give up on each other. "Yes," Sarah said finally, squeezing Eleanor's hand. Yes to all of it. Outside, spring birds sang their morning songs, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. But the most beautiful sound was right here in this room, the mingled laughter of a baby who had been saved by love, and the boy who had saved them all by refusing to walk past a crying child on a cold winter night.